Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Ashok Sivanand, CEO and founder of Integral, a digital transformation firm that helps businesses with embedding a technology DNA to their culture, processes, and experiences by collaborating to build delightful products and high-performing product teams. Ashok, I'm so excited to chat with you, not only about your background, your experience, but this whole kind of digital transformation movement, which I think obviously your company is really focused on it, but a lot of companies in various industries, I feel like, are moving to more digital, whether it's infrastructure, operations, or even from like a product sense. They're really integrating really new and fast, and honestly, even use technology that's just in terms of the weight also of tech that it's becoming less and less. So I'm excited to chat with you and seeing what you've been working on, the companies you've been chatting with. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company?
So before this, I've got to move around just a little bit. I've always kind of had some kind of draw to manufacturing. One of my first real jobs was a forklift driver. And then I was in engineering school at the time. I got to work at a GM Suzuki plant
Yeah.
and built software for the plant. And then worked at a startup in a suburb of Toronto called Shoplogix, where we built software for manufacturing.
Yeah.
And then I changed all of that and got to go work at a company called Pivotal Labs, where it was building software. I wanted a little bit of a break from manufacturing and automotive. And the cool thing was that I got to learn a lot of how the manufacturing processes or the Toyota production system was put into play for how to build software. So I was always like in the manufacturing world building software. And then now I was in the software world using manufacturing principles. I had this big like humbling moment where I was like, oh, I never thought to apply these
Yeah.
principles to how the software is built in itself. So I got to work at this really cool company. Pivotal, unfortunately, doesn't really exist anymore. They were kind of transformed into a platform company. I was always a services person. So as they were kind of transitioning away into platform, going public, I decided to stay in services. And that was kind of some of the origin story about starting Integral, the services business.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit more about the types of companies and types of industries that are looking to find more digital solutions and looking to partner with a company like yours to be able to, whether it's, I don't know, upgrade their technology. What in particular, what type of companies and what are their requests? What are they building internally that we don't see?
Yeah, I think the type of companies that we tend to work best with or are happiest to know that we exist are folks who are kind of on the bleeding edge or like the first 30% of the innovators, if you will. And those folks know that off the shelf products and customizing those don't necessarily give them that advantage over their competitors,
Yeah.
whether it's changing the way they engage their customers or even their internal operations and employees. And then the other thing that I think folks like hearing about us is when they go from transitioning to, hey, we should use technology more or building technology more to,
Hmm.
hey, we need to change the way we think. And that's where this DNA component comes in of like,
Hmm.
it's not just engaging customers and employees. It's about what kind of new business models can we do now that we can have it powered by some form of technology or have more automation in the process for
Yeah.
things that used to be manual. Now, it's not a matter about automating everything. There is a needle to be thread about some things are best done by humans, and we should give those humans superpowers so that your customers or your employees, whoever is using the technology or engaging with your experience, has the best of both worlds. Then it gets into capital allocation. We're based out of Detroit. I mentioned a lot about my auto background. And usually when you're building a new car, that's a 3 to 5 year thing, right? And you've been like a lot of the car companies have been doing for decades, centuries even. So you have a pretty good idea of like how to do that 3 year project
Right.
to get a car out the line. But when you're allocating capital for software, you can do that in like 6 weeks at a time, if even less, to go test ideas out before doubling down into like a big thing. So I think like even like the CFO's office and then even like the head of talent, right? The chief people officer, whether it's hiring and organizing talent, you're transitioning towards hiring a different and competing for a different segment of the labor force. And so that's also another place to think differently. So I think the folks that we tend to serve best are ones that kind of know that, hey, we need to change things at more of a foundational level of our business, not just in terms of what products we're building, but actually how we think and how we can really compete with the companies on the coast that way. So that tends to be
Yeah.
the target audience that likes us.
Yeah. And thinking about just, you mentioned manufacturing principles, and this is sparked my curiosity. what are those principles? And is it, I guess, yeah, what are those manufacturing principles just to start? And then I'm sure I'll have more questions about how you've integrated that within the software development process and how that's been effective to the company or the customers that you work with. Tell us a little bit about those principles and how it implements well with your customer base.
Yeah, and certainly. I think a couple of the key things that come to mind that I got to learn in the manufacturing world are the Toyota production system and
Yeah.
lean manufacturing. And the second thing was theory of constraints. So for the manufacturing or operations nerds out there, the Toyota production system book is pretty big. And then for theory of constraints, it's a book called The Goal. And it's oftentimes like a textbook in like MBA programs written by someone named Eli Goldratt. And those were some of kind of I call it the Bibles that I would study when I was working in manufacturing, because we had to empathize with the people we were building for, and they had been studying that. So for me to write the software, be a product manager, be a salesperson in that world, I had to learn it. And then a lot of the basis of this on the lean side are really to minimize waste, right? And there's different kinds of waste that show up in the manufacturing world. And it's similar in the software world too. Like if you're building features for a product and no one's going to click on that button because no one asked for it in the first place or no one finds value in it, then all of the lines of code, all of the effort and coordination that went into getting that feature out there, it's almost like building a stack of widgets that a customer was never going to buy or no one ordered. So it's very similar to what you may have heard of like just-in-time inventory, not carrying a whole bunch of inventory, but instead optimizing the process so that when a customer orders something, that you have it, your process can adapt really quickly to that order versus having to place a lot of assumptions and build up a big warehouse of inventory that may never get sold or things may change and it may become outdated. It's very similar to be able to compare those things to software. So, so that's kind of lean and the first big thing. And then theory of constraints is the other one where there's usually a bottleneck to any system. Just like in a manufacturing line, it's usually the slowest machine. And it doesn't matter if all the other machines are making a bunch of noise and doing a bunch of work. The slowest machine's not doing anything. Then if you zoom out, then you're shipping fewer containers out of your factory at the end of the day. That heartbeat of the line is the thing that sets the pace. So in the same way, if you look at the bottleneck of a software team or a software system of how something goes from ideation to delight for a feature, there are different steps along the way, different friction points, different points along which there's little bits of waste or friction created. And knowing wherever that is in your system at all times and going and solving for that as a higher priority from an operational standpoint compared to just looking at, hey, there's a lot of engineers hammering away at keyboard, so we must be making money, is a very unsafe assumption to make versus looking at, hey, where's that critical point that tells us that this is meeting the business outcome we set out for. So those are kind of a couple of the main things that I think I was really beneficial to see in real life as things were being made in the manufacturing world so that I could kind of translate into an imagination or into a dashboard or something when it comes to looking at software teams shipping code.
Yeah. And thinking about just like implement for the other founders out there who are, one thing that you said is being almost understanding your team to where the bottlenecks are or where the time constraints are, where any constraint is. How do you kind of think about that when you're running a software team, running an engineering team and making sure that they're creating a process, like, as you said, when there's an input or when there's something that needs to be built, it can be built in almost like a predictable time frame because software is so difficult to actually predict when it's going to be completed. The timelines for projects oftentimes get extended or even get completed more quickly based on the many different factors. But how do you understand more so where the bottlenecks are on your own engineering team? How are you setting up? Is it systems that you have in place to track developers? Is it is it coming to meetings and kind of going over the critical information? How are you able to understand more about your engineering team, where the bottlenecks are, and how to create a more well-defined process? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're really lucky to have is that we didn't have to write the book, right? Mm-hmm. Like I came in from the manufacturing world thinking, how do we apply these principles? And then there are folks before us that have done some large scale experiments. So there's a book called Extreme Programming Explained, and this kind of subset of agile software engineering that has some fairly prescriptive engineering practices. And then you
Yeah.
can combine that with other schools of thought that are based off the same kind of first principles, like lean startup is one, human-centered design combined with lean, combined with agile. There's a very similar kind of first principle that spans the three. And I think we've been able to inherit and iterate on a process that
Yeah.
puts those kind of three roles or three problems into lockstep. And the three problems are, hey, what is it that your customer wants? What is it that's worthwhile for this business to further invest in and pursue? And what is it that we can feasibly actually build as an engineering team, right?
Yeah.
So oftentimes I think what happens is that the folks who are maybe in marketing that are responsible for the kind of customer facing experience, the folks who are on the strategy side or maybe on the finance side that kind of allocate resources and funding, and then the technologists, they don't oftentimes play well together at companies.
Yeah.
At big companies, like for some reason, like they're in different buildings, different countries. The marketing team and the strategy team have better snacks in their building for some reason, right? So it's just like different cultures everyone's operating under, and you're trying to compete against startups, which are like four folks in a garage who are turning over and constantly understanding what the vision is, understanding and sharing context on risks and goals times a day. So like that context sharing and not having alignment in vision and the goals and the risk, I think is like one major factor that just is like startups who can't afford to have those silos just don't have them. And the enterprises who have better distribution, maybe not the same level of innovation, have to overcome it. So that's kind of the startups versus enterprises are competing with each of their strengths. So we have like not just an engineering team. We have also a product team and a UX team. And we've kind of designed it intentionally so that we can bring together those three different problem sets. And by extension, a lot of our clients will bring together folks from marketing and strategy and technology all into the same room. And we'll initially be the bridge of helping get them aligned and seeing the same thing. And then once they see the same thing, whether it's in terms of where we're trying to get to, what's in the way, how do we measure success, then we can get into a weekly cadence where we drag everyone together, and then they start slowly speaking each other's language. So initially, a lot of our work is like the orchestration, making sure that stuff happens, because these are all pretty skeptical folks coming to the room, making time in their calendar for us on top of like what it costs to work with us and everything else. And so that rigorous process is definitely pretty important for us to gain that predictability. You touched on something interesting that I think is probably a hot topic, a topic that has caused some level of strife, is around like predicting development times, right?
Yeah.
And I think predictions, like I've kind of worn the different hats. I've been an engineer before who's been asked for the estimates. I've been a product manager before who's asking for the estimates, and you see both sides and you realize, hey, the engineer, and if you don't take that with the grain of salt that comes with a guess, you're setting yourself up for a false sense of predictability when there's actually a lot of uncertainty. Right. So embracing that uncertainty is probably like the common thread of like, hey, we don't know as much as we think we know what we're doing. But at the same time, we need to have a high level of conviction that what we're doing is probably right. And if we can balance those two things of like, hey, we're probably onto something big, but we could be wrong. And you can manage those two things at a very foundational level. And a lot of the other stuff tends to fall in place, but human nature is not really like, we tend to want predictability in our stuff and cling towards good news, like are slow to respond to bad news. And if we were different, we wouldn't need the systems and processes. But since we're not, getting these processes in place end up being really helpful for identifying where those risks can be and mitigating them really early.
Yeah. Thinking about that expectation piece, I'm sure you've worked with so many customers at this point now. Where are the common missed expectations when they come in to start building technology? If they haven't already had an in-house team, or if they've maybe had a bad experience or what have you, what are some of the common missed expectations that companies come to you with, and how are you able to realign them towards whether it's like the process to building their product vision or what kind of is going to be incorporated in the development process? What are some of those missed expectations? How do you kind of alleviate those when thinking about development and thinking about doing this whole collaborative motion and building this process? How are you able to kind of mitigate those expectations or realign them?
Yeah, I think, where this type of process tends to work like really, really well in the scale up phase, right?
Yeah.
And so you're a founder, you know this. I'm sure a lot of the listeners know that as you go through different phases of maturity for your market and for your business, you just have to kind of rewrite the structures and operating systems, right? If you've put a lot of process in the early days, then you're investing a lot for resilience for an idea that may not have legs in the first place. So you end up like burning a bunch of funding. But when you go from like a team of maybe 7 engineers and now have to scale that to a team of 70, you can't rely on the same level of high bandwidth context that you share when you're grinding away in a garage and folks are working crazy hours, and you have to transition towards something a little bit more predictable. And that's almost like the proactive versions are the folks who kind of see like, hey, my joints kind of hurt a little bit. Let me start taking some supplements. Yeah. And then the reactive version is the doctor telling you like, hey, you got to stop eating bacon, right? Yeah. So whichever way people end up there, I think that's one thing for founders to consider is that like, as your teams grow, you need to come up with like a different operating system to respond to how to gain the most amount of efficiency from your team. That's reflective of the phase that you're in. And you got to kind of be savvy about where you are there. I think the other things are in terms of not clarifying what the vision is. And that could be like the strategy teams themselves, not necessarily doing some level of primary research, which I think is pretty important. There's a lot of industry context out there, and primary research can be done fairly quickly and fairly cost effectively. And it gives the whole team an additional sense of, hey, who are we solving this problem for? What's the problem we're solving? How bad of that problem it is? How would they describe it in their own words so that when you come back to ideating features and prioritizing things, that you've got a pretty good sense of what the customer wants here. And the same thing with the business, right? The business may be starting out here and conquering this hill, but over time, like the war looks very different. And understanding from the strategy team, like, hey, initially we want to go here. And after that, this is where we think we're going. We don't know for sure. This is what will help us understand what to revalidate the strategy. Yeah. Again, like when you're thinking about it from a data and analytics standpoint, feedback from the team, all that context is really helpful. And then for the business folks to understand, like, hey, what is it that's really challenging about the technology we're trying to build? If it's just a bunch of forms that we're going to apply some light level of logic to it, it should be fairly predictable. Now you start to do things that you're expecting the user to respond in a certain way, or you're integrating with some core technology that maybe hasn't been integrated with much. There's a series of risks that can come up, or you're building some kind of model in-house and that model hasn't been validated. Those are things that I think, going back to what I said, we tend to assume a high level of predictability around based on estimates and assumptions people are making. But we forget to ask what assumptions they made, or we forget to ask what the criticality is of the implications if the assumptions are wrong. And it's not to say that they should slow you down, but I think having a better informed team can help you prioritize how to go after mitigating, and de-risking is a word that comes up often on our teams. And the risks tend to be in 3 areas, right? It's those 3 things we're trying to bridge. Does the customer have a problem that this solves? They want it? Is it usable for them in the customer side? Is this viable? Like, is this worth the investment in the long run if our assumptions are correct? And what are those assumptions around how much market adoption we have, which regions we're targeting, et cetera? And then the amount of investment that goes into the technology and how much we want it to scale. I think if we put those things in tandem, the chances of those missed expectations come down. And the other thing that I like to coach our customers to do is, instead of asking the dev team how long something's going to take, change that question to, what can we get done by this date? Right? To give them as much context and then let them solve and come back and like, hey, end of Q1, I need this. And that way you just know, like, hey, you're not moving this deadline, but you can be a little bit more flexible on what you build or how robust you build it, depending on how big of the audience you're going after. And the more niche you go, the less features you have to build, and also the less scale you need, but it's a high amount of feedback and information you can get back. And so getting in the room together and having really good facilitation to have these conversations that are at some level of a common language so that the engineers, the business folks all kind of understand each other. I think those are ways in which you can pretty easily at least get aligned in terms of what we're up against and where we need to go, so that we can, it's our risks, not engineering's risks and design's risks and so forth. Right. So I think that's another thing that often comes up for us.
Yeah. And thinking about just what the building process or building software and building technology, what's in what you've seen in the market, what are some of the tech that's being used? What are some of the technology that are becoming more and more popular? And why are they becoming more and more popular? Whether it's a certain type of language, like commonly we see React being used because it's part of the JavaScript framework. We see React Native being adopted to build native applications on both Android and iOS to kind of save time, but also have such flexibility and adaptation. What technology have you seen becoming more and more popular, and why is that? And is it pretty predictive based on the industry or that your client's building in?
That's hard to say. I think things like we tend to do a fair amount of work in the enterprise, and things like Spring Boot
Yeah.
are definitely adopted a lot compared to maybe something like Rails, which if you're an engineer and you look at the use case, you'd think like, hey, this should be perfect even for an enterprise use case. But for reasons that adoption never happened, we're seeing that kind of transition certainly from a lot of the other frameworks like Angular into more things like React, TypeScript, and so forth. There is a fair amount of backing in the open source community, I think, and it's being used for some, like Facebook started it, right? And it's being used
Yeah.
for some fairly complex things. And so there's a lot of eyes on it. So anytime you embrace open source from like that's built, that's initially started or largely funded by an institution that has a level of funding like a Facebook does, but is also like competing day in and day out for eyeballs like Facebook is. There's a lot of flexibility, I think. I think what we're seeing, what we saw about a few years ago was in this concept of microservices, where instead of building your server-side application all as one, you build it separately so that you can deploy them separately, test it separately, and enables a
Yeah.
lot of efficiency and speed. That's coming to the front end now, where as companies are getting, as products are getting bigger and you're trying to distribute your teams, an AI activity means like there may be parts of some new company that you bought that you want to integrate into your UI. There's this new pattern of micro front ends. It's relatively new that's come out that I think is something else that we're going to see more of, and different tooling associated with helping with the orchestration of that across the teams. Those are a couple of things. Of course, there's a lot of buzz with the ChatGPT API and what you can do with that. Until a few years ago, whenever anyone said they want to build like a chatbot for their customer service, my initial reaction is like, why do you hate your customer so much? And I think like, I'm going to peel back that answer a little bit now, because the new tools, this new generation of tools is definitely going to be a lot less painful to work with. It's going to be hard to ever replace the humans on the other side. But if you can give the same number of customer service reps just the ability to go a lot deeper and a lot broader and help reduce wait times and also create a fair amount of self-service, I think there's a couple of things that are going to come around the corner there. But yeah, those are some of the key things on the tooling side. On the process side, I think some of the things that lend really well to the going fast that I talked about before on the engineering side are looking at things like your test automation, right? Like really relying on your engineers to be accountable to the quality for a large part. And if you have a QA team, you're using them more for exploratory testing or consulting to your engineering team on what to look out for in the tests, as opposed to having this big gate at the end of your development cycle where QA needs to go through all of it before you can go out. That's a huge amount of time loss and a huge amount of manual effort that has like a massive propensity to be automated, that I think are things that folks aren't necessarily looking at. Continuous integration alongside these tests, I think, is another piece. Like a lot of folks I find tend to use continuous integration just for building the iterations of their application and having a place to check in their code and integrate into their repos, but not using this like really available option of having tests gate the integrations, where when you're an engineer and you check on a piece of code, you know right away whether you broke something or not right at that point. And if you did, that's the cheapest, fastest time to fix something, is right after you broke it and before you push it, before anyone else knows. So I think going back to that idea of unit testing all the way up through other higher levels of testing, and then having your team integrating that, I think those are some things that they're kind of like eating your vegetables. It's hard to develop the habit. But once you get there, you're really thankful. And a lot of engineers that even kind of graduate, our alumni, go away and they're like, yeah, there's no way I wouldn't like test drive my code, even if I'm not working in consulting anymore. And we hear the same thing from our clients. Another thing is, have you ever heard of pair programming? Does that come up in
it comes
before?
up, it comes up occasionally. Yeah. Yeah.
That's another part of like extreme programming, something that we find really useful, both for having an extra set of eyes on the code and driving predictability around the readability and quality. But more so, I think for us, it's the fastest, most effective way for us to take a smart engineer from our client that has maybe worked on more traditional technologies, J2EE or something kind of more internal focused, and then make them an engineer that can build like consumer grade applications that
Yeah.
whether it's your employees or your customers, they're expecting like Facebook, Instagram level of UI and responsiveness. And pairing allows for us to get really deep and play with our client engineers. And then we've taken it from engineering and also extended it into pair design, pair product management. So for someone who used to be a project manager or business analyst at a client, but what is interested on the other side, we can pair with them and
Yeah.
coach them on how to go from becoming a project manager to becoming a product manager and kind of changing their careers, but also changing the trajectory of what that talent force looks like for the client. So I think these are things that folks tend to, they're kind of very operationally focused things, right?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
they're not kind of like the latest and greatest that folks tend to gravitate towards or on the front page of kind of the tech magazines or editorials.
Yeah.
But they're the tried and tested things that if you can do with discipline, it's like sleeping, working out, eating a lot of vegetables. There's nothing new about those things, but you know that your chances of longevity and a resilient life are a lot higher. So those are the things we tend to be really good at and we want to teach our folks how to do or teach our clients how to do.
Yeah. It's incredible to think about the efficiency and the operational like mechanisms behind running not only an efficient engineering team, but also getting the predictability to a certain point level of confidence, but and also deploying different applications, seeing them, testing them, and iterating them quickly and efficiently. It's a hard process to do, and there's so many different components to be able to actually measure the success of a lot of the things that you deploy. And it's awesome to see kind of your level of knowledge and your level of sophistication and consideration at each piece, because a lot of times companies will partner with a company like yours and the outcomes are a little bit, there's like, they kind of miss those expectations, but hearing how you've kind of defined it and hearing the manufacturing kind of principles integrated in here is so cool to see what it does for actually the production level and the efficiency of building products. And I'd love for you to share to the audience. Tell us a little bit more about the traction. How many customers are you working with now? How many customers are you looking to continue to work with? What's not only excited about the traction you've seen in the past, I think, 5 years, but also what's kind of in the next stage of journey for Integral and what you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. We are usually working with handfuls of clients. We've got a team, our total team, including like back office folks like myself, is in the low 50s.
Yeah.
So there's only about 5 to 8 engagements concurrently that we're working on. I think what's interesting for us, if I look at the future, one thing is we're just going to continue getting better operationally ourselves and getting more efficiently, allowing more accessibility to our services for our clients and continuing to kind of chip away at the new technologies and incorporating them into the system. I think from a business model standpoint, something that we're scratching at the surface on, we worked with a client that was kind of a little bit more mid-market. We've done a lot of enterprise work with big auto companies, big lending institutions, like the biggest in the States kind of level. We got to work with a private equity backed company that just has fewer players at the table on their board to make decisions. And they're remarkably more entrepreneurial. And I think for us to do joint ventures and co-investments with our clients is the next thing around the corner for us. And we validated this and maybe this tool that we've built as an internal tool for you could be something that you can spin out and make available to your partners, your competitors even. And it's going to be really hard for you to grow that within your current organization. So how about we carve it out and go to market together, where we are the product and technology and you are the strategy and capital, and share the risk and reward. And so if we continue along that, 10 years from now, it'd be really great for us to be in a place where we only work on things that we invest in and we invest in all the things we work on. And I think having both a product and engineering team allows you to think through both the strategy and execution really well, so that we can evaluate those product ideas and investments alongside our clients and kind of put our money where our mouth is. rather than
Yeah.
being purely a strategy or purely an execution type of services business.
Yeah. And thinking about whether it's external or internal, what are some of the biggest risks that Integral faces today?
I think the tech layoffs certainly have like a lot of the factors here at this
Yeah.
specific time and place that we're in. Interest rates going up means folks are rethinking some of their investments that they had earmarked for the year. And
Yeah.
so in the short term, I think we're going to come up against some headwinds with respect to demand, and the tech layoffs also mean that our clients have the ability to kind of bring in some talent faster than they thought. I
Hmm.
think some of our clients are realizing that it's not just a matter of headcount, bringing folks in. It's a matter of putting them into a good system and culture, and getting some help over there to help them get there faster. So those are some things that we're doing to mitigate. I think if I think more long term, because I know this is going to be a temporary thing. If I look back, I think it's going to be kind of not being able to get out of our way,
Yeah.
or getting to getting to like what they call fat and happy in any specific phase of the adoption curve of what we're delivering, versus looking at other options of how do we bring in a more global workforce to help our clients, whether it's helping them hire them or using them ourselves, where we're kind of mostly North America centric right now. And we've gone to a hybrid workforce. I think there's a lot more that we can learn to overcome time zones, take advantage of other efficiencies there, but at the same time, do it in a careful way where you're not introducing a lot of the risks that come from offshoring your software development, and that we've learned a lot more about in the last 10 years or so as an industry. So I think being able to be nimble and respond to those changes and kind of check is something that I worry about often,
Yeah.
and something that I'm constantly running experiments with our team. It's nice to have a product team in house who are really rooted in experimentation. So they hold me accountable to being somewhat structured in terms of the things we're trying, and evaluating the viability of them.
Yeah, I love that. And I always like this next section. I call it my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with the rapid fire questions, and then we'll see where we get. First question is just to open it up. What's particularly hard about your job?
So I think I am wired to be a lot better at sort of a bridge between the strategy and operations, or strategy and execution side, maybe a little bit more lean towards the strategy side. And so day one, it was basically myself doing everything. And then as we kept hiring folks, it's delegating different things.
Yeah.
And so focus and priority is the thing that I'm constantly just going back to the drawing board and reminding myself why we're doing things, checking if it's still relevant, checking if there's someone else that I should be bringing along, and delegating this work to if it's going to be big, instead of, there's always a thing where you get too late where you're like, oh, I should have delegated this to a long time ago. And here we still are. So that's a really hard part, I think. Another thing is one of my superpowers was sort of in-person one-to-one networking, which was really helpful when we were smaller. And also before the pandemic, when there were just a lot more in-person things to do. And now I think we're kind of slowly building our way back into in-person events. And also for me to have to teach a lot of that skill around, why we're here, who we serve, what we solve, how we play, and teaching more of my team how to tell that story, so that I'm not the bottleneck to that anymore. Yeah. So I think oftentimes it's looking at what am I getting in the way of, and how do I get better at delegating that? Those are kind of some of the main things.
And we didn't get a chance to touch on it yet, but tell us about Integral Detroit. Tell us about what you're running, the community you're building, and also the outcomes that you're really to share with the audience. I know you've been doing a lot of work around diversity and inclusion, and getting people to, or working with engineers, working with teams to kind of bridge the technology gap and within this big technology ecosystem. Tell us a little bit about Integrate Detroit and what has you excited about what you're working on.
Yeah, thank you. I think Integrate Detroit, we started it, depending on who you talk to, like not early enough or too early in the life cycle of our business, where it was at a point where I was running two things as a first-time founder without knowing how to run either of them. And the goal always was to, even in our day jobs and Integral as a services business, to have a place where people can come and do their best work and grow the most, right? And I think we've got, and personal development, professional development, I think is a barrier that we can remove to having our talent gain accessibility to the next thing they want to go do. And I think so, not just looking at the alumnus, but looking also at the intake, we realize that it's generally really hard to hire talent. When you look at the challenges associated with hiring a well-represented group of talent in a city like Detroit, that's 82% Black, but it's probably the inverse when you go inside any of the corporate offices. It's a very stark problem that's staring you in the face, not just about race, but also on gender. And we know that things like pair programming are going to help you learn how to code much faster. We know that things like test driving code simplify code to read and to write. And these are kind of hidden tricks that we have that are available to everyone that no one else seems to want to know.
Yeah.
And then the third thing we know is that the tech ecosystem is going to be one where you don't really need a degree anymore, right? So if you're building my house, you're building a bridge in my neighborhood, I have engineers with degrees that have certifications. But there's a lot of code that needs to be written where you don't necessarily need those kind of degrees. And I think tech is also such a fast moving pace that it's hard for educational institutions to change their curriculum as fast as the industry is changing. And so there's another inefficiency where like there's this really lucrative industry and career, and then a lot of folks trying to get there, but this like very expensive university system that's in between it. So we created Integrate Detroit as kind of a finishing school for boot camps because we realized we can hire boot camp grads ourselves. And so we started out as a really immersive program, and we're still finding exactly where we fit in the place there. It's not for profit, and we fund it ourselves. And we started out with some income share agreements for our students. And now it's a little bit of an introduction to tech and helping folks kind of consider what role in tech to go into. So if you know someone that is debating a career switch into tech, check out integratedetroit.org. We put on a number of workshops, clinics. There's one-on-one mentorship and other things available. We've got new stuff coming. So get on that mailing list, come to our events, and we're just here to help people get into tech. And I think one part we didn't talk about, as much as I started out as an engineer, like I needed one of my engineering managers to sit me down and tell me like, hey, I love that you could talk to the CTO. And like, when you come back and tell us what his vision is, like we seem to understand it a lot better. You seem to like talking to marketing and sales. None of the engineers like doing that. We love reading your tests. We love reading your documentation. We don't love reading your code though. And so I was kind of like forced, or someone else made the decision for me to go become a product manager. And then that led to like really great career for me. Like I went from product and then went into like pre-sales engineering, like sales before coming back into product and delivery. And so there's a lot of folks out there, I think, that maybe think that engineering is the only way and creating software is the only way to build a career in tech. And you're not necessarily wired to have the same level of patience or focus. And you might have like another breadth of skills that can come into play where there are other careers that are adjacent to tech that can be almost, or if not more lucrative, without having to write code as much as like a little bit of foundation in writing code is always helpful. So that's another thing that we tend to help folks with is like identifying where their skill sets might best align in a tech career without like writing code being the only option, as much as it's certainly the safest bet in many ways.
It's amazing to see kind of how you're using, it's almost like upskilling, but in a really natural way in terms of identifying someone's skill set, leaning into that individual skill set, identifying where it fits within this ecosystem. And also the beauty about startups is if you're an individual who is a jack of all trades, but not necessarily an expert, it's almost like a personality like benefit because you're able to be so adaptable and be so integral for different parts of the business rather than trying to define a niche or trying to be very much like focused in one particular avenue and gain value there. It's like everybody has their own skill set. So it's awesome to see the work that you're doing, to hear about the way you're going about it. And how I can just see the benefit naturally as someone who goes through the program, kind of thinking about where their skills are, how to lean into them and how to gain value in different companies and organizations. I know you mentioned a book earlier, but I'd love to ask you this question because I love how founders kind of extract knowledge from anything that they ingest, whether it's early in your career or now. What other books or people have influenced and impacted you the most?
Yeah, I think the goal was certainly one that I mentioned earlier. I think if you're a founder, like understanding your systems and systems thinking is pretty important. And this is like, it's one of those books that's written like a novel and it has a story. So it can be kind of a fun read and you're learning some stuff along the way. I was lucky that someone gifted me Linchpin by Seth Godin early in my career. And that kind of talks about the same thing along the lines of the sort of jack of all trades concept of there's different things that you're doing every day that you can be really good at. You don't have to be good at just one. You can be good at combining a couple of those things and making yourself indispensable. So folks who are younger in their careers, the book's a little bit dated now, but I think a lot of the same principles that apply. And then I don't think I would have gone into jumped into entrepreneurship if it weren't for 4-Hour Workweek. And it's got a very cheesy title that sounds like very unrealistic, but if you go past the title and actually get into the book, I think there's a lot of mental models and challenging of assumptions in the book. And then now, if Tim Ferriss had a church, I would go every Sunday. I listen to most of his work, and I've kind of followed his journey from being very efficient at work to very efficient at learning to now being more emotional and spiritually minded and kind of learning things that require a little bit more of a leap of faith. So I've been able to kind of follow his growth. I've been thankful for the content he's putting out to be able to kind of learn from all the folks that he gets to surround himself with. And so those are some of the things that come top of mind of things that I tend to follow and listen to.
Yeah, incredible. I love, like I said, I love asking that question because every founder has something similar, something different. And if they read the same books, they extract different things. So it's always exciting to learn more about what you've ingested and how you've kind of taken the lessons and implemented them. Last little bit before we go into your plugs.
Actually,
go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. There's one that I find myself recommending to founders outside the Midwest a lot.
Yeah.
And it's called Traction by Gino Wickman, and it's part of EOS. And I am surprised. I think there's some level of Midwesterniness to it. And I feel like folks on the coast are too cool for it or something, but it's got it really simplifies how to run a business, how to operationalize your business. So if you're a first time founder, it is totally worth checking the book out. And then you can go real deep. You can hire consultants to come help you implement it and everything else, but at least just get started by getting some of that primer on how to run a business. What are the core parts you need to think about? That book Traction by Gino Wickman is one that I find a lot of folks come back and they're like, wow, I had no idea this was here.
Yeah.
And it's usually folks in the bigger cities that tend to think that they've got it all figured out that have the biggest humbling moments after reading it. So for the founders, I would definitely have them check that one out too.
Amazing. I love that. I'm adding that to the reading list. We always kind of promote those. And I love that different type of knowledge and what founders bring to the table. So I appreciate you sharing that as well. The last little bit before we give you a chance to give us your plug, your websites and LinkedIn's and all the areas we can find you. Is there any question that I didn't ask you that you wish I did or that you would have liked to answer before we move to the last little part here?
Man, I think you were really well prepared. I think you covered a lot of the stuff that I thought we might get in. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Of course. Ashok, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. Not only just learning about your entrepreneur journey and your experience, but also how you think about building, how you're implementing systems within your clients and really creating an amazing ecosystem around technology and updating kind of not only the infrastructure within a company, but also the ways that they're building, what they're building, the testing process. And I'm always excited hearing that more companies are building more cool things because that means at some point it'll affect me in my day-to-day life and whether I can see it or not. So it's so exciting to see that. But last little bit, give us your plugs. Where can we find you? Where can we support Integral? Where can we find you and support you as a founder? Give us your LinkedIn's, your websites, your Twitters, anywhere where we can be a supporter and even a fan and maybe even a customer of what you're working on and what you're doing at Integral.
Yeah, I'm lucky to have a relatively unique name. So Ashok Sivanand on LinkedIn, on Twitter are a couple of places you can find me. Our website is integral.io. And I think if you're a technology leader and you are trying to balance between scaling a disciplined team while also meeting the increasing demands of your business with smaller budgets and looking to make some changes there, schedule some office hours with us. We're totally happy to just nerd out with you. It's totally pro bono and point you in some directions. And if you like what you see, we can take things more formally. Same thing if you're a product designer, product manager, software engineer, or you like doing data.
Yeah.
Check us out. Check out our career page. We've got our working agreements and values and stuff published out there and give you a sense of what it's like to work with us. And that's all at integral.io. And then, as I previously mentioned, if you're if you're looking to do a career switch into technology and you find it overwhelming and you can some more humans to come solve some problems with, do a workshop with, or have some one-on-one chat, go to integratedetroit.org, get on the mailing list, come to one of our events, and we'll see you there. If you're in Detroit, Integral Detroit Meetup is something we're bringing back after the pandemic. We're having our first one April 17th. So that's another place that you can come out and meet some of our folks.
Amazing, Ashok. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and thank you again being on Behind Computer Lines today.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. Cheers.